A cargo ship docked at a European port carrying more than gold. It carried the blood, the sweat, the promise of a nation. And yet, without trial, without accident, the treasure was seized. Hundreds of millions stripped from Burkina Faso in the open daylight of international trade. Not by pirates, not by storms, but by politics. Washington whispered, Brussels obeyed. Then came Donald Trump's voice, sharp as a knife. If Africa wants access to global markets, it must pay its dues. In Ouagadougou, the words fell like thunder. For President Ibrahim Traoré, this was not economics. This was robbery. Gold mined by the hands of his people, meant for schools, hospitals, food on the table, was turned into ransom for debts written in someone else's language, signed under someone else's rule. And when the people heard, they filled the streets. They shouted in anger. They shouted in truth. But here's the question history will not let us escape. If gold itself can be stolen in the name of law, what is left of Africa's sovereignty? Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Please sub and join us for an Africa that is no longer left. The news broke not with a whisper, but like a hammer against glass. A shipment of gold, valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, had been seized before it could ever leave Europe. No accident at sea, no clerical mistake. It was politics, brutal, calculated, unapologetic. At the center of it all was Washington, leaning hard on its European allies to send a message to the Sahel. Africa may dig its own gold, but it cannot control its destiny. In the press room, Trump did not bother with diplomacy. If Africa wants access to global markets, it must pay its dues, he declared. To Western ears, it was a lesson in order. To African ears, it was a declaration of war. The gold was meant to fund Burkina Faso's schools, hospitals, and food security projects. Instead, it was frozen, treated as collateral for debts tied to the International Monetary Fund, debts inherited from colonial regimes, debts that had already drained far more than they had ever given. Inside Ouagadougou, shock turned swiftly to fury. Crowds surged into the streets, chanting words that burned hotter than the Sahel sun. They steal in daylight and call it law. A farmer, his hands calloused from years in the fields, told a local radio station, "We never signed those loans. Why should our gold pay for them?" A teacher added, "If they keep our gold, they are keeping the future of our children." President Ibrahim Traoré sat before his cabinet, the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. Some ministers urged caution. "Perhaps we can negotiate the release," one suggested nervously. "Offer repayment schedules. Seek compromise." But others shook their heads, their silence speaking louder than words. Traoré finally rose, his voice measured but fierce. "They want us to bow," he said. "They want us to pay debts we did not choose, with gold mined by our blood. If we bend today, there will be nothing left to stand on tomorrow." His words rippled through the room, awakening something that had long been buried. The recognition that this was not about finance. This was about sovereignty. Western media quickly painted the crisis as instability. European commentators shook their heads, calling Burkina Faso reckless. CNN's panels spoke of fragile governance. Yet inside Africa, the people saw something very different. They did not see chaos. They saw courage. They did not see instability. They saw defiance. On WhatsApp groups, on crackling radios, and through loudspeakers in the markets, the story spread. This was not piracy. This was not a storm at sea. This was deliberate seizure, a calculated act of humiliation dressed up as law. Mothers who struggled to buy bread shouted in protest. Youths painted banners that read, "Our gold is not your guarantee." Miners marched into the capital carrying their tools aloft, not as instruments of labor, but as symbols of resistance. The seizure was meant to break Burkina Faso. Instead, it lit a fire. The nation's grief turned into unity. The insult turned into a question of survival. And Ibrahim Traoré, far from shrinking into the shadows, began to see something larger emerging from the anger. This was no longer about one shipment of gold. It was about Africa's right to control its own tomorrow. What began as murmurs of outrage soon erupted into a chorus that shook Ouagadougou to its foundations. The gold shipment seizure was no longer just a story in the newspapers. It had become a wound that every citizen could feel, a wound that demanded a voice. Farmers abandoned their fields to join demonstrations in the capital. Miners, still in their dusty overalls, marched with hammers raised high, the very tools of their labor transformed into weapons of symbolism. Students poured out of the universities, staging sit-ins that paralyzed campuses with chants of, "Our gold is our future." The anger spread like wildfire across radios, WhatsApp groups, and the street loudspeakers. Mothers, weary from years of struggling to buy bread, shouted in defiance, "Whose gold is it? Ours or theirs?" Their voices mingled with the slogans painted on city walls. Africa is not collateral. At night, the markets that once buzzed with bargaining now echoed with speeches, poems, and songs of resistance. Even soldiers in the barracks whispered among themselves, "If they can seize gold, what will they seize next?" In living rooms and street corners, the debate took on a new intensity. Some citizens feared that defying Washington and Brussels would mean famine, sanctions, and deeper poverty. Others argued that dependence was already starvation by another name. A retired school teacher summed it up in a town hall meeting. "They have taken from us for decades. If we fear to resist, we will fear forever. But if we resist now, at least we resist for ourselves." Western media tried to twist the moment. CNN framed the protests as signs of instability. European commentators scoffed at the defiance of a landlocked, resource-dependent country. They called it reckless, irresponsible, even suicidal. But the African streets told another story. People were not confused. They were not panicked. They were awake. Across the continent, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, the news of the gold seizure ignited a sense of kinship. It was not just Burkina Faso's gold that had been stolen. It was Africa's dignity. Social media lit up with hashtags in French, English, and local dialects, declaring, "Not collateral, not ransom, our wealth, our right." Ibrahim Traoré, seeing the fire rise, understood that leadership in this moment meant more than political calculation. It meant standing as the voice of a continent. Addressing a packed crowd outside the presidential palace, his voice carried above the chants, "They think we will kneel. They think our wealth belongs in their vaults. But I tell you, this gold is not their guarantee. It is our children's bread, our elders' medicine, our land's dignity, and we will not surrender it." The crowd roared, their anger tempered into resolve. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. The humiliation that was meant to fracture the nation instead fused it together. The betrayal that could have sparked despair instead became the tinder of unity. And unity is a dangerous thing, not to those who nurture it, but to those who fear it. Because once a people believe that their suffering has a common cause, they begin to believe they also share a common future. So the question began to echo beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. If one nation could stand, why not others? If one leader could say no, who else might follow? And to you, watching this story unfold, I must ask, if you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. In the wake of anger, a question lingered. What next? Outrage can rattle walls, but it cannot build foundations. Ibrahim Traoré knew this, and so he turned fury into purpose. Within days whereon, he summoned the leaders of the Alliance of Sahel states, Mali, Niger, and allies willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with Burkina Faso. The emergency session was held in Ouagadougou, behind guarded doors, but the stakes were larger than the room could contain. Around the table, the mood was heavy. Delegates from Mali recounted how their uranium contracts had been rewritten overnight, their resources siphoned through foreign hands. Niger's representatives spoke of reserves frozen in banks abroad, leaving their own budgets starved. Each story mirrored Burkina Faso's humiliation. This was not an isolated act. It was a system. One Malian minister spoke with raw frustration. "They hold our gold because they know it is our strength. They call it collateral. I call it ransom." The room fell into silence. Then slowly, heads began to nod. The words resonated because they stripped away the illusion of partnership. What the West called law was in truth a chain, polished but unbreakable. Yet not everyone was ready to leap. Some voices urged restraint. "If we break from the IMF, sanctions will crush us," warned a delegate. Another added nervously, "Without Western insurance, our exports will stall. Our economies could suffocate." Fear lingered in every corner, as heavy as the Sahel heat outside. It was then that Traore rose. Calm but with fire beneath his words, he looked around the table and said, "They already suffocate us. Did the IMF save us when reserves were frozen? Did sanctions feed our people? No. They steal with one hand and offer loans with the other. Enough." His words steadied the chamber. For a moment the air shifted. The silence was no longer fear, it was reflection. Then came the question that would change everything. What if we stop sending gold through their ports? What if we keep it here in Africa? The idea hung in the air like a forbidden dream. For decades, the notion of an African gold reserve had been dismissed as fantasy, whispered by intellectuals, ignored by politicians, crushed by the realities of dependence. But now, after the humiliation in Europe, it no longer sounded like fantasy. It sounded like survival. Within hours, the concept began to take shape. A vault on African soil, guarded by African soldiers, managed not by Washington or Paris, but by the nations of the Sahel themselves. Gold stored not as collateral for someone else's debts, but as the foundation of Africa's own financial shield. Outside the walls of the meeting hall, momentum was building. Protesters who had once demanded the release of the seized gold now demanded something greater. Keep the gold, build the vault. Youth groups painted murals of chains snapping open, gold bars gleaming behind African hands. Farmers pledged to contribute to a people's fund, offering portions of their harvest to support independence. Western officials scoffed. One European banker dismissed the talk as dangerous populism. Another analyst laughed on television, claiming Africa lacked the infrastructure and the unity, but their scorn only fueled the fire. Because what they underestimated was the one resource Africa had in abundance: determination. For Captain Ibrahim, latest news, as some international headlines now described him. This was more than economics. It was identity. He told his advisors, "If we build this vault, it will not belong to Burkina Faso. It will belong to Africa. Our children must know that their wealth is stored where no foreign hand can touch it." The insult of the seized gold had birthed a vision, and visions once rooted in the hearts of the people cannot be seized at any port or frozen by any sanction. This was the moment when humiliation became a seed, and that seed was beginning to grow into something no power could contain, an idea whose time had come. The whispers of a gold reserve spread faster than fire. What had begun as murmurs in Ouagadougou soon reached the ears of bankers in Paris, diplomats in Brussels, and policymakers in Washington. To them, it was not just an idea, it was a threat, one that could unravel decades of control built on debt and dependency. The retaliation came swiftly. European banks froze transactions linked to Burkina Faso and its allies. Insurance companies withdrew coverage for exports leaving the Sahel. Humanitarian shipments, once routine, were suddenly delayed for compliance checks. The message was clear: resistance would be punished. Trump, never one to soften his tone, doubled down. At a press conference, he sneered, "These young leaders think they can defy the rules. But if Africa wants to sit at the table of global trade, it must first learn to follow the law." His law, of course, meant IMF contracts and dollar dominance. Anything outside of that was branded chaos. Western media amplified the script. Headlines in London called the gold reserve a reckless gamble. Talk shows painted Ibrahim Traoré as too young, too dangerous. Analysts predicted famine, collapse, and instability. It was psychological warfare, designed to turn the African people against their own leader. But inside Burkina Faso, the opposite happened. The more the West threatened, the more the people rallied. Demonstrations filled Independence Square with chants of "Our gold, our Africa." Farmers offered to donate portions of their harvest to support the reserve. Students launched viral campaigns declaring, "If they fear it this much, then it must be our only hope." Meanwhile, the global stage was shifting. In Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi, The idea of an African reserve was met with sharp interest. Within weeks, envoys from BRICS arrived in Ouagadougou carrying quiet offers: direct gold purchases, refining technology, and access to markets untouched by Washington's grip. For the Sahel, it was a lifeline. For Traore, it was confirmation. They wanted to isolate us, he told his cabinet, but they have only opened new doors. Then came the leak. Documents surfaced not from Africa, but from Europe itself. A whistleblower released internal memos from a major bank in Brussels, revealing what many had long suspected. The gold seizure had not been a neutral act of regulation. It had been ordered directly under pressure from Washington. The memos were blunt. Without control of their gold, IMF leverage will collapse. This cannot be allowed. The revelations landed like a lightning strike. What the West had framed as law was now exposed as coercion. African newspapers ran the story on their front pages. Our gold, their debt. Callers on radio shows shouted with outrage. They steal and call it justice. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was vindication. They had not been paranoid. They had been right all along. And suddenly, what had been Africa on the defensive became the West scrambling to explain itself. In this reversal, the movement gained something far more powerful than sympathy. It gained legitimacy. The world could no longer dismiss Traoré as reckless. He was no longer just a young captain turned president. He was the man standing between Africa's dignity and its humiliation. And that was when the struggle shifted from survival to triumph. Burkina Faso's latest news was no longer just about a seized shipment. It was about a continent awakening to the truth. Africa's wealth would never be safe until it was guarded by African hands. By the time the leaked memos spread across African airwaves, the seized gold was no longer just a story of theft. It had become a symbol, a flag carried not in fabric, but in fire. Burkina Faso's loss had ignited something larger than itself. Across villages and cities, across deserts and rivers, people began to see the truth. Gold was never just metal. It was freedom. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stood before miners, their hands still caked with the earth they had dug. His words cut through the dry Sahel air. You are not digging for Paris. You are not digging for Washington. From now on, your work will build Africa's strength. The applause thundered, echoing far beyond the capital. For the miners, this was not rhetoric. It was recognition. Their labor, long dismissed as raw export, was now declared sacred, the foundation of a sovereign future. Momentum spread. Mali pledged to channel its uranium revenues into the same reserve. Niger followed, offering its gold and copper. Guinea signaled its intention to contribute bauxite wealth. What had started as one nation's response to humiliation was morphing into a continental project. Leaders who once hesitated began to lean forward, emboldened by the fire of their people. The West grew frantic. European regulators tightened restrictions, attempting to cut off African trade routes. Cargo bound for Asia was detained under security inspections. Banks in Paris and London froze credit lines for Sahel businesses. Washington unleashed its fiercest weapon, fear. Trump thundered on international television, warning that young African leaders were selling Africa to the East. But fear no longer worked. Because when the people saw their leaders called dangerous by foreign mouths, they did not recoil. They cheered. If they call him dangerous, one student leader declared, it is because he is dangerous to their power. Symbols began to rise everywhere. Youths painted murals of gold bars breaking free from iron chains. Farmers formed cooperatives to sustain the reserve even if sanctions deepened. Soldiers issued rare public statements declaring, "Our loyalty is to the Republic, not to foreign hands." In that unity, something historic was born. The African Gold Reserve was no longer just a policy drafted in government chambers. It was alive in the chants of demonstrators, in the art on the walls, in the determination of miners, farmers, and students. For Traoré, it was the fulfillment of a truth he had carried since the first day he wore the uniform. Sovereignty is not declared, it is defended, and now the defense was collective. At the AES summit, beneath a sea of flags, he delivered the words that would be remembered across generations. They thought our gold was collateral, but it is not collateral. It is freedom. And freedom does not beg, it builds. The crowd erupted, and for the first time in decades, Africa did not feel like a market or a debtor or a pawn. It felt like a continent waking up. Yes, the blockade remained. Yes, sanctions continued. But something more powerful than sanctions had been unleashed. Conviction. And conviction, once born in the hearts of a people, is harder to crush than gold is to seize. The West had tried to bury Africa in shame. Instead, they had planted a seed, and that seed was growing into unity, into resistance, into the unshakable belief that Africa's tomorrow could belong to Africa itself. The gold never returned. The containers seized at that European port remained locked in foreign vaults, guarded by signatures written in Washington and Brussels. But by then, something far greater had been gained. What was stolen as metal had been reborn as meaning. Across Burkina Faso, headlines no longer read gold seized. They read nation united. Across the Sahel, conversations no longer centered on debt. They centered on destiny. Farmers, miners, teachers, and soldiers understood a truth that could not be embargoed. Freedom is not given, it is claimed. For Captain Ibrahim, latest news as the world now called him, the battle had never truly been about bullion. It had always been about sovereignty. He had taken an insult designed to break his nation and turned it into a movement binding a continent. Western governments still warned of collapse. Analysts still predicted famine. Yet on the streets of Ouagadougou, the people sang a different song. They sang of dignity reclaimed, of children who would grow up knowing their wealth belonged not to Paris, not to Washington, but to Africa. At the closing session of the Alliance of Sahel States, Ibrahim's words rang out like a prophecy. They thought our gold was collateral, but it is not collateral. It is freedom, and freedom does not beg. It builds. The applause was not only for him, it was for every African miner who had swung a pickaxe, every farmer who had sown a field, every student who had carried a banner. The applause was for Africa itself. So let us ask, if one nation can stand, why not many? If one leader can say no, who else will rise to say yes? Yes to unity, yes to sovereignty, yes to an Africa that bows no more? Africa, rise. If this story moves something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear. Captain Ibrahim, latest news. Burkina Faso, latest news.